Okay. Good morning, Professor Hamilton. Thank you so much
Good morning.
for being here and for this great opportunity to for your consideration to for this interview about commodity prices in the context of COVID-19, high inflation, and the Ukrainian war. Our interview will be organized in 4 parts. The first one is about commodity prices, commodity price dynamics in the context of COVID time. The second one will focus on commodity prices and geopolitical tension. Then we will have some questions to better understand in the third part, the relationship between commodity prices and the macroeconomy. And finally, we conclude our interview with some question about what would be the commodity prices in the future. So if I'm going to start with my first question is as follows. What are your views on the present levels of commodity prices, especially oil and gas, please?
The price of oil nearly tripled between June of 2020 and March of this year. It's an even bigger increase if you take the change relative to the ridiculously low prices we saw in April of 2020. So that definitely puts it in the class of the big historical oil price shocks that have received a lot of study. And it's not just oil, commodity prices more broadly. For example, the price of copper nearly doubled over that same period.
Thank you, Sabash. So if still talking about the commodity prices, so commodity prices displayed actually high volatility during the COVID-19 outbreak, but also in this post-COVID-19 period. Is there a linkage between COVID-19 and the volatility of commodity prices?
Oh, absolutely. COVID brought much of economic activity to a standstill. People weren't driving to work. They didn't want to fly. That may be the biggest short-run hit to demand that we've ever seen.
Okay, thank you. So, what are now according to the mechanism which could explain the interaction between commodity market and coronavirus? For example, can we talk about a policy shock, a demand side shock, a supply side shock?
Well, there were certainly disruptions in both supply and demand, but I would emphasize demand in the first phases of the COVID downturn. There was supply available from inventory, but people weren't buying it. And the demand shock in turn was heavily influenced by policy, as you mentioned, namely the mandated lockdowns were keeping people from driving to work. Later on in 2020, it turned very much into a story about supply. The crazy low prices caused a lot of producers to go out of business, and those that stayed in were much more cautious about putting money and investment into the business. And in fact, the U.S. today has still not recovered the levels of production that we saw before COVID. So that's 100% an issue of supply, not demand.
Okay, well, now when looking at this oil price volatility, for example, if we go back to April 2020 and we look at the WTI price turned negative, and it reached the level of minus $37.63 a barrel, which is the largest one-day decrease since 1983. So would you please comment on the causes of the negative oil price? What does it mean, a negative oil price? What this incident, for example, a simple inventory problem?
Yeah, that's an interesting story. The negative price was a result of the mechanics by which U.S. oil futures contracts get settled. These contracts are settled by physical delivery of oil. The product goes to Cushing, Oklahoma. And the vast majority of traders of futures contracts don't actually want physical delivery. So the buyers and the sellers of the futures contracts usually net out their position before expiry. But if you go to expiry and no one wants to take your long position off your hands, they're going to ask you, where do you want us to put your 10,000 barrels of oil? And if storage facilities are all booked, you may actually have to pay someone to take the oil off your hands, a negative price. It's like the classic short squeeze, only in reverse. In this case, it was the buyers of the futures contracts were squeezed by the fact that they could not unload the physical oil. And they waited to a point where that was what they had to do. Now, of course, that's an artifact of the exchange mechanics, but it also reflects a fundamental reality that demand temporarily fell tremendously. And it was a real development in the sense that many other contracts get written using the spot or the settlement price of WTI as a reference. So this negative price definitely contributed to the shakeout in the industry and bankruptcy of a number of producers.
Okay, well, so still again one question about this this oil price volatility. As you know, it is not the first time that we observe this volatility. So over the last few decades, commodity prices have also shown high volatility. If I'm going, for example, to cite what happened in 2008, 2009, in 2014, 2015. Are there any useful similarities or lessons that can be drawn from this early period and today?
Yes, both supply and demand have always been relatively price inelastic. And that means even if the shock to quantity is relatively modest, you can end up seeing huge swings in price. So that was historically true and it's still very true today.
I see. Thank you. As you know, we conducted in 2019 an interview that was published in Energy Journal, and I remember you mentioned that historic supply shocks typically represented disruption of about 5% of total world production. Now, how does that compare with the size of the actual or the potential disruption associated with Russia and attacks on Ukraine?
Russia today accounts for about 13% of total world field production of crude oil. So if all of Russian oil production was knocked out, that would be twice as big as any of these historical oil disruptions. But what's happened so far is that while the US and Europe are buying less oil from Russia, other countries are buying more. So it actually, as of now, has not been that big a shock to total world production, though the potential is certainly there. So now natural gas is a different story because it's a much more localized market. Germany gets more than half of its natural gas from Russia. And if that's lost, it's much harder to buy it from any place else. So what happens in Russia could be a potentially huge event, particularly as far as Europe is concerned.
Thank you. No. I have a small question about this. This what you call it, this exogenous geopolitical events. We're looking at the evolution of the commodity price in this context of geopolitical tension. I'm thinking about the OPEC embargo, the Iranian revolution, the Iraq-Iran war. We're looking at this, all these events, they seem to produce inflationary pressure on commodity prices as a rule, and in particular on oil price. Why did this event provoke a change in supply side uncertainty and therefore commodity prices?
Well, when you look at the specific months around those particular events, the price of oil moved much more than that of other commodities. So the events that you mentioned are somewhat specific to the oil markets. However, these events, such as the three you mentioned in the 1970s, the OPEC embargo, the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, took place within the context of broader inflationary pressures. So many industries besides the oil sector were facing challenges in keeping production up with demand, part of the broader inflation. And you can make a case that those broader inflationary pressures could have contributed some to even those geopolitical events. For example, OPEC might have been emboldened by the tight oil market to follow through with the embargo when the Arab-Israeli war broke out.
Okay. If we are going to consider this Ukrainian war, this ongoing war with Russia as an exogenous event, so what are the main mechanisms for which this war has resulted in changing commodity prices? And I don't know whether this is this effect of this war on commodity different for you from this shock of previous geopolitical events that we cited before?
Well, the price of oil surged dramatically on Russia's initial invasion, but it has come back down to where it had been before the invasion. And that's because the market for oil is very much a world market. The product is relatively easily transported and sells for a similar price everywhere in the world. So if the US and Europe stop buying oil from Russia, but China and India increase the quantity they get, the impact on the global price may not be that great. People didn't know when the invasion started how that was going to play out, but so far, it seems not to have been that big a disruption in production of oil. Now, natural gas, as I mentioned, is a different story. It is possible to ship natural gas across oceans, but the volume is much too small currently to arbitrage the price across markets. So this may be different from historical energy shocks, and that its impact is felt much harder in some places, such as European users of natural gas. We still don't know how events are going to unfold. News from Russia today that has us all worried. It's a tragic situation, and things could change any minute.
I see. We understood, Professor Hamilton, this difference between the oil market and the gas market, and the fact that the oil market is the global market, while the gas market is different. So in this context now of war, and this when considering this geopolitical instability, what would be the best solution to lessen the volatility of commodity, and especially for the gas market in Europe?
I'm disappointed that the United States did not respond more aggressively to take measures to increase our natural gas production and build up the infrastructure to get it to Europe. Europe is going to face a real crunch this winter, and we've known that for some time. Longer term, the more diversified the energy choices, the easier it is to deal with events like this. Many people are catching on. I think that the move away from nuclear energy may have been ill-advised. And the geopolitical costs of depending on a country like Russia for key energy supplies, I think are now clear to everyone.
I think thank you. So now, as you know, both the US and the European Union have imposed a series of sanctions on Russia in order to try to constrain Russia's ability to fund the war. In your view, have they been successful?
Stopping US purchases of oil from Russia, I think, was largely symbolic, to the extent that other countries bought the oil instead. Sanctions on sales of specialized equipment to Russia may be much more important and effective. Now, this idea of price caps has caught on politically as something maybe you could build an effective coalition around that we haven't been able to so far with the embargo on the product itself. But I think in part this may be based on wishful thinking. The real way and the only way to negotiate a lower price is to buy less. And that's what the world so far hasn't been willing to do.
I see. And could you please comment on whether Europe can survive the winter if Russia completely cuts off natural gas export? Because they told us that we should expect a hard winter. What do you think about that?
Well, it will impose significant hardships and adjustments that could have a big effect on the European economy. But certainly Europe will survive a cutoff in natural gas deliveries. When the missiles start flying, that's when you worry about your survival. And it makes me so sad that the tragic conflicts that many of us thought we'd put behind us in the 20th century are still taking so many lives today.
Okay. My next question now about what we could expect from Europe. How quickly do you think Europe will be able to substitute away from Russian supplied energy through LNG, conservation, renewable?
Well, unfortunately, some of the substitutes take the form of going back to coal, at least for purposes of getting through this winter. And I think both near term and longer term, nuclear has to be part of the picture. I do hope that LNG will be stepped up, as I was saying, but it's going to take some time before that can make a really big difference.
I see. Thank you very much. Now, after this analysis, Professor Hamilton, of the commodity prices in the context of COVID-19 and the analysis of this commodity prices volatility in this time of geopolitical tension, let's now focus on the relationship between commodity prices and the macroeconomy. You have been among the first who have worked on this topic, taking into account all the past events for oil markets. So now, if at present the inflation rate has reached the highest level in the US and in Europe, and what portion of the inflation is due to commodity price increases, and what are the other main drivers of the inflation?
Well, one rule of thumb is that if the price of oil goes up $10 a barrel with no other prices change, it would add maybe 0.2% to the headline inflation rate. So when you do that calculation, you conclude that maybe a quarter of the rise in inflation in 2021 could be attributed to oil. But the reason oil prices were going up last year was because demand recovered from COVID faster than production. And it's the same thing in a number of other sectors. For example, a shortage of chips has been keeping automobile production down, and workers who retired early aren't coming back to work. That's creating some supply pressure, shortages, increase in prices. So this gave rise to broader inflationary pressures, of which commodity markets were just one example.
I see. And as you know, Professor Hamilton, over the 2 last years, when we try to analyze the situation, the world has been through a major pandemic with COVID-19. And this pandemic was followed by the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so that has implied a considerable geopolitical tension. These two events have impacted commodity, the whole economy. In what way did this event impact the relationship between commodity and the economics of developed and emerging countries?
I worry not just about the energy bill for developing economies, but also food prices. Ukraine had been a key producer of food for the world. And now, if we do see an economic slowdown in Europe and the US, that will be a big hit to developing and emerging country exports. I also think that China may be experiencing a separate shock from their ongoing efforts to contain COVID there. And if that happens, it will be very important in terms of depressing the prices that developing countries receive for their exports of raw materials, for example. So the whole world's in this, not just Europe.
I see. No, my next question is about this relationship between the US dollar and the oil price. The US dollar, for example, actually reached the parity with the euro. How do commodity prices impact this parity or be impacted by this parity between the euro and the US dollar?
Well, the US Federal Reserve seems committed to trying to bring inflation down by raising interest rates. And that leads to an appreciation of the dollar and lowers US demand for goods. And it may be one factor, the higher dollar, lower demand, that have contributed to the recent declines in commodity prices since the invasion started.
Well, and now when looking at this current context, how it is characterized by, we said, high commodity price, maybe uncertainty, at the same time an increasing inflation has troubled both investor and policymaker. Could you comment on further on how that this commodity uncertainty affect the US and European economy?
There's a very strong correlation between gasoline prices and consumer sentiment in the US. When gasoline prices go up as much as they did in 2021, it makes people much more pessimistic. And that was likely a factor contributing to the slower economic growth that we've seen in recent data, and sometimes can interact with other shocks or pressures on demand to bring the economy into a recession. We're hoping that's not going to happen this time, but it could.
Yeah, I see. To now conclude this fourth part about this relationship between the economy and the commodity price. As you know, to fight against this inflation, both the Fed and the ECB have announced that they will continue to increase interest rate to attenuate the inflation rate. They will also revise their programs of purchasing financial assets. Are the current policies calibrated enough? Well, in your view, will they have an impact on commodity prices and the uncertainty?
I worry that the Fed thinks they have more control over inflation than they really do. It seems their plan is to continue to raise interest rates until inflation returns to normal levels. And I think if they follow through on that, it could well result in a recession. There are already significant threats to economic growth that we talked about earlier, and monetary contraction could tip the scales. So obviously, U.S. monetary and fiscal policy were much too stimulus focused in 2020 and 2021, but you can't turn that around in a few months in 2022. So I would favor a more gradual, long-term focus on bringing inflation down because it's a very careful path and narrow path we have to walk on at the moment.
Yeah. To ask my question differently, Professor Hamilton, when you mentioned 2001, and we know that at that period the Fed decided to use this what we call the rate policy. Okay, it is possible to avoid economic recession, but you could cause the inflation, and vice versa. Actually, for example, we want to fight against the inflation, but we know that we can provoke an economic recession. Is there any trade-off between these two problems?
Well, sure, there's a trade-off, but as I say, I think we don't want to be overconfident. It's not as if it has a push and bing, inflation goes right there to 3% or 2.5 or whatever. There are legs in these things. And so if you're asking, is it possible to have 2% inflation for the next year and not have an economic downturn? My answer to that would be no. I think that's not feasible. We have to be more realistic, more humble about the situation that we face. And it's going to be very hard, as I say, to try to bring inflation down now that the genie's out of the bottle without causing other serious problems.
Thank you. So let's now speak about this projection about the commodity in the future. There has been always a challenge and uncertainty about the commodity supply, which yields, as we said, commodity price volatility. And the uncertainty and volatility have rapidly increased because of the war, as we said, in Ukraine. In your view, will the OPEC countries be able and willing to adjust their supplies so that they could attenuate this volatility of commodity prices?
I don't think so. OPEC has always been a very loose collection of countries with very different interests. It's hard for Saudi Arabia and Iran to agree on anything. And what happens in places like Venezuela and Nigeria are beyond the control of even those countries, even their own countries. In the modern world, I think U.S. oil shale is the swing producer. And that's the factor that can stabilize markets. And it's partly because, as I mentioned, it took longer for that production from the U.S. to recover. That was a big factor in the run-up, recent run-up in oil prices. So I think we should be looking to the United States, not OPEC.
I see. So again, one more question about the U.S. dollar. Let's suppose that the U.S. dollar continues to remain close to its parity. So how will this impact the price of oil in the future?
Well, the key feature in the strong dollar is U.S. monetary policy. As long as the Fed keeps focused on higher interest rates, that will be a factor keeping the dollar up and holding oil prices down to some degree.
And now going to my last question. Has it become more difficult to forecast commodity prices, Professor Hamilton?
No, it's always been very hard. When supply and demand are as price inelastic as they are, a small change in the quantity leads to a big change in the price. And many of the events that bring about significant changes in quantities, like a war in the Middle East or COVID or the latest developments in Russia, are inherently impossible to predict. So it's always been hard and it's still hard today.
Thank you so much, Professor Hamilton, for answering my question.
My pleasure.